Michael, Evan, Chase, Brandon, Don, Michael, Cody, David, Aaron, Danny, and Josh. Okay, so where I'm going to pick up today, we kind of started, we went through yesterday, we went through kind of half of the notes, or a little bit more than half of the notes of the authentication stuff, okay? And so things I want to do today, I want to update our pet adoption project to kind of incorporate some of the stuff we've learned. And we want to go over the remaining things. I think actually at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the pet adoption agency and we're going to start doing a little bit of coding. And then we'll come back to the second half of those things. Okay? Because we kind of got enough yesterday that we can start writing at least some of the code. Is that clear? Is that good? So I want to look at how I might build part of this. And then we'll look at how to add some additional parts to it. So if you would, you're bring up the Pet Adoption version 2 project, which is where we left off. So we're going to start coding with it. I'm going to have to do a little bit of additional work beyond what maybe you're going to do for your issue tracker part. Partly because I don't have some of the code in place that you already have in place. Like right now in my pet adoption project, remember the only routes we have are for pets. I haven't created any routes whatsoever to deal with users, right? So we have to kind of build those up, right? We have to do a little bit of the backtracking to get back to there, okay? Because I need those routes to demonstrate the things we want to demonstrate. Everybody good with that? Okay. So some of the stuff is going to be stuff that we've already seen, you've already written, but we're going to do some refresh on it, and maybe you'll see a few things along the way. Okay. So in here, does everybody have pet adoption pulled up? Anybody still pulling it up? Okay. So remember that yesterday, one of the things we got introduced to was a few new packages. Okay, so the place I would start is actually to install those packages. Okay, now there were 3 new packages. If you look at your package.json, there are 3 packages we talked about yesterday that are not in our list yet. Okay, what are those 3 packages that we installed or talked about installing yesterday?
JWT.
JWT, okay, which actually JSON Web Token. If I remember right, there is a JWT package. That is not the one we're using. We're using the JSON Web Token package. So we're going to install that. What are the other 2?
Decrypt.
Yeah. Which was for passwords.
Yeah, password.
So we're using that for password hashing. And there's one more related to cookies. Cookie parser. Okay. So we need to install these 3 packages. Is kind of our first step to get set up. That's usually where I start, is get my dependencies in first. And that way my code will work. So that requires a little bit of foreknowledge about knowing what you're going to install. So these are the 3 things that you'll need to add for your lab for 501. Okay, does that make sense? Take a note of that because you'll need those for the lab. All right, let's go ahead and solve this. So I'm going to go into the terminal, npm install, and I'm just going to install all of those in one go. So JSON Web Token, and I want bcrypt, and I want cookie parser. So I'm going to install all those, and they should end up appearing in my package JSON. Again, make sure you're installing the JSON web token package, not the JWT package. So that's step one. Step one is to get your dependencies in place. So install this. Do some like that. We got those in. Your package of JSON, make sure you got this. Okay. Okay. So we got our dependencies in place. So we can actually start coding with that. So what I'm trying to build is build something to kind of work with users. And maybe there's kind of two pieces that I need. I need some functions in the database module. I need some function. I need like the actual user module, which I don't have yet. So I need to add those things to the project. So that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to go to the database first and get some methods added. So I'm going to go towards the bottom. I've got underneath delete one pet. I'm going to add some functions to work with users. So async function insert user. That needs to take a user. I'm just going to kind of lay out the signatures first. So insert user, async function, update user, and so there I want the user ID plus an update document, what to change. Okay, so those are my two methods to modify the users. I also need some functions to get the user. So async function get user by ID. This is going to take a user ID. And I also need an async function get user by email. So I need to add these four functions to support the logic that we want to do today. Cool. Should look kind of familiar. You should have already written these in labs. So this should be pretty obvious as far as what needs to go in here. Okay. Questions? So everybody kind of got that? I'm going to go ahead and throw this in the Discord just so people can refer back to the signatures. Okay, so I need those four signatures to make this work. Okay, let's start with inserting users. So const db is await connect, and then return await db.collection. So I'm going to go into my users collection. Note that I am pluralizing the name of the collection here for this project. and then I want to say insert one, and we're going to insert a user, and kind of similarly for the update document, I'm going to say const db is equal to await connect return await db.collection users dot update one, and we're going to update. Remember, we need to tell which document to update and how to update it. So we want to say update it based on the ID. So underscore ID is equal to the user ID that was passed in. And in terms of updating, I want to say $sat. And like I've done previously, I'm going to spread out that update document. Okay. So that is my insert and my update. So most of the logic for today I'm going to put somewhere else. But I need to have this stuff in place so we can actually have a database to work with. Okay, here's some clickety-clacking stuff. So we're adding functions to it. Okay, so those are my insert and my update methods. I need to add also my two getters. So in here, I'm going to say, let's connect to the database. So const db await connect bop and return await db.collection. So we're going to go into the users collection. I want to use find one because I want to find a single user. And we're going to find him based on the ID. So underscore ID equals $equals the user ID. And similarly for the find by email, I just need to look them up by email. So here I'm going to do email is equal to email. So that's all the database code that I need to support that, is those four functions. Don, you follow along? Did you get the string pulled up? Questions so far? Let's see if anybody's typing.
So on the update and insert, we're setting return on these ones. I know like on the past, we just did await.
It's fine. One of the things that you sometimes want to do, sometimes you're interested in what that returns. I don't know that I'm necessarily going to do anything with this, but it's it really depends on if you want that return value or not, right? So if I just write it this way, there won't be a return value from this function, but sometimes you want to know the details about what returned from there. So it's a give and take, depending on how you're writing the other parts of the code. There is some stuff in there that's worth kind of looking at as far as what that returns. Okay, so I got 4 database methods. We've added those in. I want to go now and add my user module. So I'm going to make a new file. This is going to be user.js. Okay, and this is where I'm going to start defining those routes. Okay, so the first route I want to kind of work with is going to be that registration route. Okay. Now, I do want to kind of build this up from scratch just to give us some reminders of how we do this, right? So things to remember, for sure, I need to bring in express. Express equals require express. Okay. I need to also make a router. So const router is equal to new express dot router. Worth noting that that new keyword here is optional. You can include it or not include it. In this case, it does the same thing. Sometimes it's a little bit different depending on if you include it or not, but not here. So module dot exports router. Right. So those are kind of that's kind of my foundation of building up a router module. Right. Is bring in express, create a router, export the router. Seen that a few times. That shouldn't be new news. Okay. I also generally want to have something to log, so I might as well also add a debug in here. So const debug is equal to require debug, and the name of this will be app colon API colon user. You know, the path that you do there is the most important thing there is that it starts with that colon. Okay. So let's define our routes. So in here, remember, part of what I'm trying to do is create a registration route. So I'm going to say router.post. So this is going to respond to post requests. And I'm going to say when the user posts something to maybe /register, then I want to do some things. So request, response, next, and we can start by saying res.send or res.send register, just to make sure we've got the right setup. Okay. Now, is there anything else that I need to do before I can go test this? Is there anything else I need to do before I can test it? Yep, in the server file. So I need to go back to server, and what do I need to add to the server? And so it's going to be like right down here where I've installing the pet module, right? So I'm also going to install that user module. So app.use /API /user and require the user module routes API user. Okay, so I'm going to bring this user module in and install it. Okay. Anything else I need to do before I can test this in Postman? Thoughts?
Export the functions and database, like add them to the bottom.
I haven't called them, so it doesn't necessarily matter. I do need to fix that. You're right. You're right. So I might as well go. Go fix that. But I don't necessarily need to have that in place to do the test because I'm not using them yet. So insert user, update user, get user by ID, and get user by email. Okay. So add those four to the export. So what I'm really getting at is, if you notice right now my server's not even running. I need to start the server. So npm run start dev. Okay, so I'm going to get the server up and running. It actually is telling me address already in use. So do I have something else running in here? Perhaps. It says 5,000. 5,000 is in use. So I'm going to go to Task Manager. I'm going to see if I have a node process already running in here. So node up there. There we go. End task. End task. End task. Okay. That problem fixed. Cool. Server's up and running. So I can go to Control F5 to just check. Nothing there because there's no home page. So I can pull up Postman at this point and see if we've got anything. Save that from earlier. So I'm going to make a new tab in Postman. HTTP / localhost, and we're going to API user register. Okay, so I'm going to make a post request on that. I'm going to hit send. Okay. Localhost 5000. Yes. So it would. The error I'm seeing, by the way, here. Notice it says IIS because I do have IIS installed on this computer from previous courses. Okay, so that much is good, right? So we can see we can get to the route. Nothing really interesting yet, okay? So that's a start. So going back to the user route, going back to this registration route, one of the next things I might want to address is looking at what data do I need to receive, right? That's usually the next place that I start, is I say, what's the data that I need to receive? And so you remember that we typically validate that data with joy. So I do need to bring in joy as well as our middleware. So I'm going to bring in both of those things. I'm going to say const joy is require joy. Reminder, the require here is lowercase, but the variable has an uppercase J. That is intentional. So bring in joy, bring in that valid body middleware that we created earlier. So valid body require, remember to get back up there. So dot to go up a folder, dot to go up another folder, down to middleware, and to valid body. Okay, So I've got those two imports added in. So joy and valid body. I need to also define the schema for registration. So const register schema. We need to create a new schema here. So this is going to be joy object. Okay. Now I'm going to keep this basic for this example, right? I want to keep this pretty simple. You guys can really kind of already have your schemas for your issue trackers, so I'm going to keep this as simple as I can. All I really need is a password and a username, or a password and an email in this case. So that's all I'm going to really put in the schema because that's all I need. So I'm going to say email joy.string .email. This is an email. Before email, I want to say let's trim it. So trim email and then required. Okay. And then we'll talk about the password. So the password is a string again. So joy string .trim. I don't really have a format for my password, but I might want to have a minimum length. So general guidance right now is that the password should be at least 8 characters long, although often 8 characters is usually not enough. But that's kind of your minimum length. That's pretty typical today. So that's a starting point. Now, one thing I want to mention, emails, by the way, are generally considered case insensitive. If 2 users have the same email but the case is different, we generally consider that as the same email, just so we're clear. So because of that, we generally represent emails always as strictly lowercase, not with any uppercase letters. So it's generally best on here, just to make a note, and you'll want to probably go back and do this on your issue tracker projects, is that you do generally want that to be lowercase. I also don't need a minimum on here because by being an email basically enforces there being a minimum already. Everybody clear with that? The format of it being email already requires the password I don't want to do lowercase on because I do want people to put in uppercase and lowercase letters and that be a different password. Everybody good with that? So that's a really good start to my registration schema. Now, just to demonstrate some of the stuff, like that's the bare minimum of what I need. To demonstrate what some of the value of using Joy, of using these JWT tokens in, we kind of talked about with the with those tokens, I can add additional data into the payload, right? So I might want to put a little bit in there just so we can see that it's in the payload. So an obvious thing to do would be something like a role, a name, and so I'm just going to add in the full name, okay? In reality, you'll probably want a little bit more there to be in the token, but just to demonstrate how that works. Cool. So I am going to add a full name, even though that isn't necessarily strictly needed for what we're doing right now. And so that's joy, string, trim. I might give that a minimum of 1 character. Oop. And make it required. Okay, so I've got a schema. I'm going to use that schema on this route. So I'm going to say valid body, has to have a valid body, and that body must conform to our register schema. So just some setup there. Okay. So at least we know when we're getting into here we have valid data. It's worth noting that this password that's coming in is going to be coming in as plain text. It's not coming in hashed. It's not coming in encrypted. It's coming over the wire completely plain text. Anybody that can see the communication can see that password. Okay. So that means, again, if you're on a public Wi-Fi, just this in place, right, there's a problem there, right? So remember what we kind of used to avoid some of those issues? Add a layer of encryption for passwords and such. Remember hearing about HTTPS? So remember, HTTPS encrypts your traffic back and forth through the server, right? So without HTTPS in place, this password could be completely unclear. Anybody looking at your radio signals going around could see it. So this is important that there's also HTTPS on the website because that's what's also adding layers to it. Okay. If you have a login screen and you don't have HTTPS, you have a problem. So you should only be logging in if it's over HTTPS. Okay. We don't have that here because we haven't set up a local cert to test that with. Okay, so that's my registration start. I want to go into here and start actually laying out the logic. So I'm going to do a try catch around everything. If there's an error, I'm going to do next. Okay, pass it on to the next middleware. Okay. In here, what are the things that I need to do? Thinking back to code you've written before, right? Probably the first thing I want to do is get the actual data that the user sent me, right? So I know the user sent me a user, so I'm going to say const user is equal to request.body, right? So that's the data that the user sent. So that will be the email, the password, and the full name. Okay. I need to then do some work, right? So I obviously need to go to the database and I need to insert that user into the database. So here's where I need to make sure that those things were exported because now I need to use some of those methods. So I'm going to go back up here, const, bring in the methods I need, const equals require, // and I want to bring in the database module. Okay. Now I'm going to pick off the methods that I want. So for instance, I want new ID, I want insert user, I want insert, or sorry, not insert user, update. Okay, so insert user and update user, get user by ID, and get user by email. Format that, it's going to bring it down. So I'm only using some of the database methods. Notice I'm not using anything related to pets at this point. So that's going to bring in all those methods so I can just use them locally. Okay, so I want to insert the user. So I might say await insert user, take the user, and then maybe just immediately send a response. So res.json and here's where I might want to look at that result. So const db result I might want to debug and log that one. and or register result. Maybe I'll log it that way. Register result. And I might send back message, new user registered. Okay. I'm not doing a bunch of error checking yet. You know, there's a bunch of things that can go wrong here with this. I am doing a try catch just to cover some of my bases, but there are some things obviously I want to check for and some more things I'll need to do. But that's kind of our start, right? Get data from the user, put it in the database, send a response back to the user. Send a response back to the client. Okay. So just trying that little bit of code, I'm going to go to Postman and try to register a new user. If I don't send any data, remember I'm going to get a bunch of errors back. So I need to go back to body, back to form URL encoded, add an email address. Let's say paul.smith@example.com. And maybe I add a password. Maybe I add a full name. And so Paul Smith. Okay. That's sound. Okay. So far so good. User register, right? Let's look at what went into the database. So if you had all that code in place, you should find in Mongo, and connect to my local database, because I'm not using the Atlas cluster for this. So local, connect, pet adoption, users, there we go. So there's the user that just got inserted, right? He's got an object ID, he's got an email, he's got a password. Okay. I can also look at my console here, and I can see what the result was, right? So here's the result that came back. It says that it was acknowledged, and here's the ID of the user that was inserted. Okay? Pretty basic so far, right? What I'll need to do is I probably want to then amp up a few different things. So I want to amp up and add some error checking, and I also want to amp up and add some more data that we're saving, and as well as things like hashing the password, generating a JWT token, all these kind of things. Okay, so there's a bit more code we want to add to this, right? But that's our basic starting point, right? That's our basic starting point. So let's talk about what are the things that, first of all, that I want to add to the user. So in terms of the user, I do want all of the data from the body, right? I also want things like I want to set the user's ID. So I might want to say underscore ID is new ID. Remember, there was also another thing that we kind of set with logging when the user was created. Creation date. Okay, we can call that a bunch of different things. So maybe I'll say I think I called it created data in the last lab. Let me just check what name I used previously. So I used created date previously. So created date is new date. Another thing that typically happens is you typically have some initial state data that you also need to add in. So for instance, things that we might want to add in is usually we don't want the users to just be able to take their role at startup, right? We don't usually want the users to just say, hey, I want to be this role, and then register as that role. Does that make sense? Usually the role has to be assigned to, okay? So typically what we do is we pre-assign them a role that's either has no permissions or has virtually no permissions. It's the very lowest level of the tier, okay? So what do we call this role? What do we call the role that the users are going to start as? Anything we want? Okay. So maybe I say that my users are going to start out as customers, as a customer. You create a new account, you're automatically set up as a customer. Okay, so if you want to be an employee, you want to be an administrator, somebody has to later come back and then change your role. And you can start out and be a customer. Anybody can sign up on this website and become a customer. Cool. Okay, so that's a typical thing that we might do. You might assign an initial role and keep that other data there. Okay, other things we need to do is typically when the user signs up, we don't want users to be able to sign up with the same email, right? If I run my post again, let's say I go back to Postman, hit send again. Notice I haven't changed the email address and it didn't complain. So usually I don't want to allow this kind of thing. So I now have two users with the same email address. Do you see the problem? I've got two users with the same email address. I don't want to allow that. I want to block that. Okay. One part of that is blocking that in the code, but I really need to block that at the database level. Because I don't want, if I mangle the code, I don't want somehow it to get into the database either way. Everybody with me there? So I actually want to enforce that role. I want to make sure I'm enforcing that role at both levels. Okay. So how can I, at the database side, make sure that their email addresses have to be unique? It's an index. Okay, but an index just makes your searches faster. So what about an index makes that happen? So you said the right word, it's unique, right? So if I make a unique index, that requires it to be unique. Okay, if it's not unique, then the index doesn't have that effect. Okay, so if I want to create that index, I'm going to go down here. Notice I'm still on this test database, so I need to say use pet adoption. Okay, so I'm switching over to pet adoption. So I want to add an index into here. I don't know, can I make this bigger? There we go. Okay, can everybody see it now? So I'm going to do db.users.create index. Okay, and so the first argument is which columns I'm going to index, and the second argument is the properties. Don't forget that you need to set them. Okay, so the first thing, what do we want to be unique? Email. Okay, and that's how I would set that. It's worth noting you can say multiple columns in here. So for instance, if I said first one, last one, if I created the index this way, I would be trying to create an index that makes the combination of first and last name. Okay. With this individually, like the first name would be the first name. Two people have the same first name, or two people have the same last name, but not the same first and last name. So I could have a John Smith and a Jane Smith, but I couldn't have two Jane Smiths. Okay. So what we're trying to accomplish is just the one column has to be unique. So email 1. And then over here, here's where the important part is. you have to say unique 1. That flags it as this thing is required to be unique. Without that, it's just a regular index. Okay. I also want to add a name for this index. So the name of this index would be email. I hit enter on that. Now, notice that I got an error here. It says build failed, couldn't build this index. Zoom out a little bit. Okay, so my guess, okay, so here it says caused by duplicate key error. So I can't add a duplicate key right now because the index is already violated. The constraint is already violated. So I can't add the index right now. Oh. Because I've already violated the constraint. So I have to fix the violation before I can add the constraint. This same thing happens with relational databases. I need to fix that violation. So what I need to do in here, either I need to delete one of the users or I need to change their email address. Okay? So if I go in here, for instance, and I change this guy's email address, the first one I inserted into, and change that to 1, okay, now they have different email addresses. I can go back into the shell and try to run that command again, and this time it will be happy. This time it will not complain because the constraint's not already been validated. Cool. That's an important level of security. And part of that is that you actually can get race conditions, and your check in your code might say, okay, that email's not used, but then when you go to insert, it might actually fail. Okay, because it's already in use. And this is kind of how we make sure that it fails. If somebody else is using the system at the same time and trying to use that. Okay, questions? Everybody got your indexes created? Okay, so I'm going to try in Postman to do the same thing this time. If I try to insert that user, this time I get an error. And this time it says duplicate here, set it off to user's index, email boot, right? It's saying this is already in use. So that's what the server spits back. That's what the database spits back. Rather than letting you do it, it says, oop, hold the brakes, there's a problem. Cool? How user-friendly is that message? I don't want to, as a user, I do not want to see that message. It's not very user-friendly. And in fact, it's kind of a security problem because it's actually telling me way more than I would want the user to see. So I actually want to do my own check so that I can give the user a more friendly message. Ideally, you'd want to be able to catch this exception and say, hey, this is a duplicate index exception thing, and get your message that way. My experience, and I haven't necessarily tried this with Mongo per se, but my experience with other databases is oftentimes it doesn't give you a special sort of error message for these violations. So it's just like, well, okay, I guess I got to do a check myself. So it's hard to kind of rely on the result on this, because otherwise you'd be forced to read that error message and turn it into something nicer. So I'm going to actually go back and do a check to make sure that that user doesn't exist yet. So before I actually insert it, I can construct the user, but before I insert it, I'm going to say if await get user by email, and I'm going to pass in user.email. And I would say, well, if this gives me back a user, well, then I know immediately you can't do this. So I might say res.status, say this is a 400 error, and send back some JSON, kind of saying as much. So I might say error email user.email. Oh, I've got the wrong quotes. I need to do a template string here. Email is already in use. So I can give a much nicer error message if I just build it out myself. And I can say otherwise, we can do the rest of the code. Questions? Does that all make sense so far?
So our database index is just a backup.
Yeah, it's a backup. It's really just a backup to make sure that you know, if there's race conditions and other things that happen, then that doesn't occur. Or if users for some reason have direct access to your database to insert things, that they can't violate those unique constraints. Okay, because those unique constraints are really important. So this is yeah. It's sort of a backup. You could think about it as, I would more call it primary check. And this is the only reason that I'm doing this is just to make it more user-friendly. Like, actually, that's the way I think about it. This is the only reason I'm doing this at all, is to give the user a more user-friendly error message when something happens. Okay. So if I hit send now, I'm going to get that nice message. Email paulsmith example.com is already in use, and that's great, right? So that's not leaking any details about the implementation. Just good.
How did you get yours to show up with that formatting exact implementation? You just hard code it in, right?
So I put quotes around. Oh, I put quotes around it. Yeah, so I put quotes around the email connections. Let me go back here. Yeah, in the template string, I put quotes here around that. Okay, that's what made it show. When you look at it in Postman, you'll see it's a slash quote, because in JSON you actually have to escape the double quotes, which it kind of automatically does for you. So when I actually say res JSON, this is taking this, turning it into JSON. As it turns it into JSON, it escapes the double quotes. That's what's happening. Make sense? So JSON does already a bunch of that stuff in terms of escaping things and such. Okay. So that's a good start. So we checked some of the errors. Are there any other errors, any other things that could go wrong? What else could go wrong? So user's email might not be unique.
Maybe we don't want them to feel like we were. Never mind.
Yeah, I think we're pretty good. I think we're pretty good for error check. So the next thing I want to do is walking back and dealing with the password. Okay, so if I look at what's in the database right now, we still have plain text passwords. I still have my password in here that literally is the word password. And anybody who has access to the database knows my password. Which, ideally, that's a very small number of people. But in reality, it may be a few different developers that have access to production data or other users. And it's just straight up a problem if anybody were to get access to this and were to be leaked or get out on the internet. Now all of the passwords are just there. Okay. One fair forewarning. If you ever find a website that is able to tell you what your password is, they are not secure and they're doing this. If you're able to ask them and they were able to tell you what your password is, this is what they're doing. Okay? There is no reason that any website should be doing this. Okay? No website should be doing it this way. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to hash it. So let's bring in our hashing code. So remember, we need to bring in bcrypt. So I'm going to go back up here. Const bcrypt is require bcrypt. So if I bring up the material from yesterday, and I go up and look at bcrypt, okay. Remember the code that we kind of put in place was we say await bcrypt hash. And part of why I wanted to look back here is say like, oh, okay, it means it's asynchronous. It returns a promise with you. So that means when I go into my code, I'm going to have to include that. So looking at here, what I want to do is I want to say the user.password. I'm going to take the password that the user entered and hash it and replace it. So here I'm going to say user.password is equal to await bcrypt dot hash, and so we're going to hash the user's plain text password that they gave us, password, and then I might need to say how many rounds of hashing. So maybe I do 10 rounds of hashing. Okay, so what this one line is going to do is take that plain text password again, hash it, save it back. Okay. So if I try to register with that one line change, we should see a difference in our database. So remember I need to change my email address. So I'm going to say paulsmith2 and send. Okay, user registered. And if I look at the database, now I've got a hashed password when I registered instead. Okay. This is what you want to see, right? This is what you want to see. This means there's no way for me to go back from this to figure out what your password was. All I can do is try password, and see if it works out. Now I can brute force this. It might take me a good long time with some sort of dictionary tag, but I can't just strictly look at this and say, okay, I know your password. Everybody good with that? Turns out this is not a very secure password, so it would only take a few seconds to crack it because password is such a often used password, unfortunately. Okay, so that's what I want to do. Now, I have a little bit of trouble because I've had 2 users that I inserted previously and their passwords aren't hashed. Right? These 2 users are a problem. I need to fix them. Any thoughts on how to fix them?
So you want us to fix recent database?
So you just update them, right?
I could update them. How?
You can set up your route.
Okay. Yeah, I will need to set up an update route. But I haven't set up the update route yet. So what do you do? Because your data in your database looks like this right now.
We're gonna get MongoDB open, MongoDB compass open. Click on the user's password, copy, paste it into online hashing. Copy that, paste it into MongoDB compass. Save.
Yeah, and I could do that. I could do that. what I would recommend is kind of like I did yesterday. You should do a quick application. So if you look at this on what page is this? This pattern is about hashing with that. If you just took this code right here, let's take that code. Guess what? That takes a password and spits out the hash. So if I just took this and threw it in a JavaScript file, that would do it for me, and I don't have to worry about whatever other funny business that websites may be doing. Right? Like saving the password that you entered, or maybe giving you a bad hash, or maybe using a different version of bcrypt. Yeah. So I'm going to take this, throw it in a file, and that way I can kind of test it out. So maybe I pull this in and go back to my program. I can kind of throw this anywhere. I think I might create a new folder for this and call it tools. And maybe I'll make inside of the tools folder maybe a new file, hash password.js, and I'll paste that code in there. Right. So I kind of feed in a password and have it come out with a hash. So if I want to try and run this, I just say nodemon that is in tools / hash password.js. Okay, and spitting out a password. Maybe this is not kind of what I want. I might want to have it come in as an argument, but this is maybe enough for me for now. So I'm going to just type in what my password was. Password. There we go. So now I've got a hash of the user's password. I can take that and I can put that back into here and fix this data. So I'm going to put in that here, update, and I could go do the same thing again. Password there, and go back in here. Now, the reality is all three of these users actually have the same password, but notice their hashes are different, which is actually kind of the benefit of some of this stuff, especially with salting, is that even though these users have the same password, I don't know, right? I have no way of knowing other than testing and seeing if the password works out.
So how can you know if what they're typing in the login is correct, if what they type in is different?
Right. It's because, remember, we take the salt, concatenate that with the password, run it through hashing. So when I run this, when I check the password, I'll be using the same salt, which is contained within that, So that makes it reproducible, is because the salt is stored in there as part of that string. And I forget if it's at the beginning or if it's at the end. But bcrypt makes one of these. Cool. So you should have a database that looks like this now in Fed Adoption, right? Where all my passwords are hashed, which is good. Another thing I commonly want to do, anytime the user registers an account, I typically want to go ahead and turn around. Let me kill this here. I typically want to go ahead and turn around and give the user a token. Go ahead and get them logged in. Right? I usually want to say, okay, you're registered, we've logged you in. Usually I don't want the user to have to come and turn around and go log in again after they've just registered. Does that make sense? It's a big kind of usability difference. If you have to do it twice, you're going to lose a lot of customers. If you have to register and then log in. So we want to do both of those things together. Is that clear? So I need to also in here issue a token. It's worth noting that I can't issue the token until I know that we successfully inserted the user. Okay? Because I can't give you a token for a user that's not in the database. That would be bad, right? It'd be bad to have a token floating out for a user that doesn't exist. So I want to make sure that that happens first. So going down here, right? This is where we're going to issue the token. And up here is, by the way, where I'm going to hash the password. So I hash the password up here. I issue the token down here. Okay. So in terms of coming up with the token, remember the first part I need is a payload. And the payload is whatever data we want to put into that token. Okay? So what data would be helpful to put into the token? The ID of the user. Okay. So I can add the ID of the user. Notice I'm not going to add all of their information. So I'm going to say ID is user ID. What else? Their role, maybe? Okay. What else? I might want their email address, right? So I can refer back to that easily. So I might want email, user, not email. I want their full name. And that's kind of enough data for what we're doing here. So I'm going to grab their ID, their email address, their full name, and their role, and so that data will be contained within it. Does that make sense? Cool. Kind of can be whatever you want, but that's typically what it looks like, right? So data to identify the user, data to kind of know what their permission is, anything you've got like where you want to show maybe on the nav bar to show who's logged in, you definitely want to have that information there. Cool? Okay. So that's my payload. Remember, I also need a secret to sign the token. And I might actually rename these real quick. Call these Auth payload and Auth secret. So my Auth secret, I need it to be what? Remember, I need it to be secure. What did I say you wanted to do with that secret? Huh? I said very long. Yeah. Something about 256 characters long. What else? Put an environment variable, right? So I want to be able to pull it out of an environment variable. And so I could do this one way. I could say process.env like something like auth secret. That would pull it directly from the environment variable. But remember, we kind of put config in the middle, and we said, well, any sort of config related stuff, I actually want to pipe through configuration. So rather than doing this, I'm going to bring in the config package and use that instead. So const config is require config. Okay, so I'm going to bring in the config package up there. And so down in here, rather than using the environment variable directly, I'm going to use config.get auth.secret. Okay, So I want to pull it from the config package instead. Okay. Remember, I also need some options. And so I want to set that up in here. Does anybody remember the option that I used? What was the option yesterday in the code example that we used? If you take a look on the reading assignment on your notes, you should find what that option was that you set. Expires? Is it just expires? Expires in. Okay. So remember, expires in was to tell us how long this token is good for. So I'm going to say expires in, and where did I pull that from? What environment variable did I pull that from, or configuration? I think if you look at the example code, I think I pulled it from auth expires in, right? So this was something I wanted to pull from configuration as well. So config .get auth .expires in. So I'm pulling both the secret and the expires in value. Both of those are being pulled from environment variables. Okay. Once that's all done, we can actually generate the token. Okay. So I will want to bring in JWT. I didn't bring in JWT yet. Const JWT require JSON web token. So convention is you use kind of the longer package name here and then just JWT on the left. Okay. So JWT is brought in, back down. This is going to be our token. So const auth token is equal to JWT dot sign. And we can kind of look at that method. We can see the payload comes first, the secret comes next, and then the options is the last thing. So I'm going to pass in auth payload, auth secret, and auth options. Okay, that's going to get us a token. Now, if we want to see if this works, I should be able to come back here and say token is auth token. So that's going to just send that token back as part of the response, which means that our front-end code could potentially use it. Other things I might want to also send back, I might also want to send the user ID while we're here. So user ID is user dot underscore ID. So I'm sending back a few things, the message, the user ID, the token, etc. Useful information. Good. So we've got a token. Let's give it a test. Give it a test run. So I'm going to try and add a new user this time. Paul Smith 3. Send. Uh-oh. When I tried to run this, it said, couldn't send the request. Okay. I think in my server, I'm not actually running it. So npm run start dev. There we go. Back up running. Try it again. Okay. So I get back this error. Configuration property auth.secret is not defined. Did we forget to do something?
No.
We forgot to do something, right? So we can use configuration options, right? We can add our own. We can add them freely as we're working through these things. That's perfectly fine. But you have to remember to go back and add them to the config files. If you don't do that, then you're going to get this error coming out of it. Cool? So I'm going to go to my config files and we're going to add the stuff that we need. Namely, we saw Auth secret, we saw expires in. There's another one that I had set in there, which was, I think, the max age. So I'm going to start by going to the default file and define an additional setting, another group. So I'm going to say all the stuff we want related to authentication and authorization. We're going to put all those options over here. So I've got a section for HTTP settings, I've got a section for database settings, and I've got a section for authentication settings. Okay, so we've got a secret. Maybe by default it doesn't have a value. That'd be the safe thing to do. I want to expires in. For this website, how long do you think our sessions should last? How long should it be before our sessions time out? 10, 15 minutes? That seems pretty short, right? Maybe, depending on what you're doing. You know, this is, if it was a bank, probably 15 minutes is pretty good, right? If I'm doing something, say, social media-wise, how long does your Facebook session last? Pretty close to forever, right? Have you ever seen a session timeout on Facebook? Have you ever seen a session timeout on Instagram? Most social media is pretty long. So that could be longer there. So there's a give and take, right? You know, there's a lot of value to having users that are continuously logged in all the time, especially when you talk about social media platforms. On the flip side, when we talk about banks and other things like even medical technology, our main constraint is like, well, our main concern, or rather, is, well, what happens if user XYZ, if Paul leaves his computer and somebody else comes and uses the computer? Could they potentially get into the system and use it, right? And so if I give it a 4-hour window, Paul can leave his desk, and within that 4 hours, anybody can get on the computer and use his session, right, without needing to re-enter the password.
Is this session that's described in the token, is that the same as, okay, we haven't seen you active on Postman for a while, would you like to log out?
No, it's the time since the token was issued. So
those two things linked, or are they not?
They're not implicitly linked, no. So this token just says, we're saying this token is good for a certain amount of time, okay? Once that time expires, the token's dead. If you want to extend that token, the only way to extend a token is issue a new token. Is that clear? The only way to extend a token is to issue a new token. You can't change the time or the expiration date on an existing token. You have to make a new one. Does that make sense? So if you're trying to have something to say 10 minutes since the last activity, repeatedly you're going to have to refresh the token. And usually what we do is we say, well, when there's a certain amount of time left, then refresh the token. So we might issue, say, to make it easy, let's say we issue a 20-minute token. And if there's only 10 minutes left on the token, then we refresh it. Does that make sense? Because the downside is refreshing it is kind of expensive. It requires a bit of work, and it requires a bit of a trip to the database to get the data that's in the token. Does that make sense? So we want to avoid refreshing the token as much as we can. But if we're going to do that kind of thing where it's based on user activity, you do have to constantly be refreshing the token. The other way that you can work with that is remember that there's two sides of the expiry. The token has a certain lifetime, as well as the cookie has a certain lifetime. Okay, so one thing that some people do is they say, well, the token is good for up to 4 hours, but the cookie is maybe only up for 10 minutes. And so that way I say, here, we're going to issue a token. That one's good for up to 4 hours. So after 4 hours, for sure, your session's cut, you're going to have to relog it. But the cookie only has a lifetime of 10. We'll refresh the cookie every time you come back. Does that make sense? Because it's pretty cheap to extend the lifetime of the cookie. It's actually really cheap to extend the lifetime of the cookie. More expensive to extend the lifetime of the token. Does that make sense? So oftentimes you may have your token expiry to be a lot longer, but your cookie time to be a lot pretty short. Cool? Okay. And we can do that, and maybe we should play around with that here. So let's say I do something interesting, and I say, well, let's just have the token be good for 24 hours. 24 hours. So we say, this token is potentially good for up to a session of 24 hours. And maybe we'll make the cookie have a shorter lifetime. So say the token is good for a whole day, but the max age for the cookie. Now, this name's not fixed in stone. I mean, you can use other names. So I might say, if I wanted to be more descriptive, I might want to say like token expires in, or I might want to say cookie max age, right? If I wanted to be maybe more descriptive about what these kind of things are. So maybe I'll use those here for this example. I'll use those two names to kind of specify where these two pieces are going. Now, if I want this to be 20 minutes, what number do I want to put for the max age? Not exactly. It's milliseconds. So cookies are measured in milliseconds. So what's my number there? I would like to. Unfortunately, I can't. I can't here. So we can at least think about what the multiplication would be, right? I said 20 minutes, right? So what's the smallest unit? Remember, we're dealing with milliseconds, right? So milliseconds to seconds is 1,000. So 1,000 times our next unit, we need to go from seconds to minutes. And then I said I wanted 20 minutes. Okay. So that's the number that I want here. 1,000 times 60 times 20. Okay. I can't write it out that way. And I can't also, JSON also doesn't allow comments, so I can't even put that in comments. What number is that? 1.8, you said 1.8 million?
Yeah. Or 180,000?
I don't think that's right.
I have one.
120.
60,000. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. 1,200,000. So that is 20 minutes right now. I wish I could add a comment on it and say that this is 20 minutes. Unfortunately, you can't add a comment here. So it's just that. Okay. So we've got those things in place. Remember, you also want to set up some environment variables. So back on the environment variable file, auth and actually pull in the same keys so I don't fat finger anything. And so this needs to be, the key would be auth secret. This would be auth token expires in auth cookie max age. There's another common thing you might want to configure and might want to play around with. You notice we kind of hard-coded the number of rounds of salting that we used when we salted the password. That's also something you might want to configure. So we might want to also put in here something for the salt rounds. And say, well, that is auth salt rounds. And also put the same setting in here, defaulting it to 10. So I'm going to half screen these so you can get all that information. There usually ends up, just as you can kind of see, there usually ends up being a good amount of information around authentication and security stuff that you have to set. Okay. You got all that stuff ready? All 4 keys? Okay, well, let me try and do that. I know I'm speaking. I'm asking, did you get this kind of?
So we re-explaining what this kind of big file is.
Huh?
This big folder.
Mm-hmm.
Got the default JSON and custom environment variables.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me that the custom environment variables like points to the default JSON because it shares between names.
Yeah, so both of these are kind of defining the structure, and the structure needs to match. The difference is what's to the right of the colon. Okay, so the right of the colon on this file is the default value. If I don't set a value, this is the value of that configuration option. If it's not set by anything else, that's what it starts out as. Okay. What I'm declaring over here is what are the names of the environment variables that I can override those things with. So if I use these environment variables, so auth secret will replace the value over there, auth salt rounds will replace the 10 over there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the name of an environment variable, but that is a value. Does that follow? Everybody following with that? Okay. So that's the distinction between those two things. Now I need to fix the code a little bit because I changed the name. So auth token expires in cookie max age. So when I come back to my code, I need to fix that here. So this is token expires in. So I need to change that little piece here. Also worth noting, I need to go back up top, and instead of 10 here, I want to do config.get auth.saltrounds, because we just added that key as well. That's another thing.
I'll choose the default.
You'll choose the default one or whatever's in the environment variable. Right? The environment variable would replace it. Okay. So I could in an environment variable say, hey, it's 20 salt rounds, and then it would be 20 salt rounds instead. Another important thing to note. So with config, These things may or may not come back as numbers or strings. Okay, these may come back as numbers or strings. So looking at this file, when I set this up, at least the way I set this up, notice that in default.js, that this is a number. Okay, so if it pulls it in actually from the default file, this will come into my code as a number. But if it comes in from an environment variables always come in as strings. So the safe thing to do is assume that anything you pull in from config, those values are typically going to be pulled in as strings. That's the safe assumption. So I kind of have a problem in my code that I've presumed that salt rounds is a number, right? I've presumed that this has to already be a number, but that's not guaranteed. In fact, salt rounds can't be a floating point number. I can't have half salt rounds. I can't say 10.5 salt rounds. This has to be an integer. So when I'm pulling in config like this, I do actually have to use things like parse int and parse float to clean up the data. So here I'm going to say parse int, get the salt rounds, and do that. Sometimes this starts getting a lot of code all in one place. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll take this out and kind of put it in its own variable, const salt rounds, and put it here in a variable rather than passing it directly, just to try and simplify the code a little bit. Not strictly necessary, but usually ends up being more readable that way. Cool? Questions? Okay. So we've got some environment variables set, right? We've got some configuration set up. Okay. Let me go back and try Postman real quick. Remember previously I got this error, configuration property auth secret is not defined. I'm going to get a different error this time. Okay. This time I get a different error. It says secret or private key must have a value. Okay. Notice it doesn't say anything about config this time. Everybody see that? It doesn't actually say anything about config. And I could look at the stack trace to find out some more information. So here it says error secret key must have a value. It points us to say, hey, there's some problem with JSON web token.sign. Or if I look down one more step in the stack trace, the problem here is on line 53 of my user module. So everybody see that? So when I call jwt.sign, if I don't pass a secret, I'm going to get that error. Does that make sense? You get that it's saying, hey, you didn't pass a secret. It doesn't know whether it came from config, or it doesn't know that it's a problem with config. But at this point, it's a problem with config. So things you may want to do, and oftentimes I do, is maybe go back up into like the server module or earlier in here to check that those things are actually set before we get any further. Because I may want to detect these things right away and not get these kind of unfriendly errors later in the code. You see that? So what we often do is kind of a guard. I might go up to the top of this file or in server.js. Maybe I go up here. No, I'm going to leave this alone. I'm going to go to server.js. Over in server.js, we're going to say, okay, yeah, towards the top, we've got config pulled in. If not config .get, and I'm going to check some of these variables. So if I put a check at the top of server.js, the server will just not even run if this thing isn't set. Because more than likely, if my login system's broken, I might as well just not have the server running. Right? Usually that's a thing where I want to know right away, an immediate signal that something's not right, just stop. Does that make sense? So generally speaking, if you have a important configuration, you want to check those things up here, right? So that includes several of these things with authentication. I might also say like, hey, it expires in, token expires in. If that's not there, then we can crash. I might also put something in here for the database. So I might say, hey, if the db.url, if that's not set, we're done, right? There's no point in the server running if we don't know where the database is. There's no point in running this if we don't know what the secret is and those kind of things. So we often want to do a little bit of validation of our config at server.rs. And remember, this is in server.js. So that way it doesn't get to a later point in time and we find out that these things are. While you're here, also add a check for the cookie next stage as well as the salt. So we're checking all of our kind of major configuration to make sure that it's good. The other two that we set up. So it'd be cookie max age and the salt rounds. What often happens with this is when you go to deploy a new version of your server, you're going to push it out in production, you want to see that these things are set up properly before users actually see them. And if you crash the server this way, your administrator is going to see it before the users. More than likely. Right? It's like, oh, well, we tried to deploy the new code, it's not running, it's telling us why it's not running. Otherwise, the user would get it, and you try to register an account. Right? So that's part of why you want this. This would be server. So take this, let's do confidence and all. That's what we're working. So that that's a good guard, okay, to make sure that we're doing this properly. Another thing that we want to watch is we want to watch and make sure that we've actually set the secret. You'll notice so far that we haven't set a secret at all. In fact, kind of in the default, notice I kind of explicitly left one out, right? I didn't set a secret, right? It's actually kind of intentional because I want it to fail. I want it to fail if this thing's not defined. Does that make sense? I want it to not be in there because remember part of what I said yesterday is that I want the secret never to be checked into code, never to be checked into GitHub. And so if I put it in here, this file will be checked into GitHub at some point. And then I run the risk of potentially using that secret in production and never knowing that I'm using that in production. It will just work, right? So I want the server to break, right? I want the server to break if the secret isn't specified in the environment variable, which is why I'm not doing this, and it's why we just added the check to server joins. This intentionally crashed the server. So in environment variable instead, in our environment variables, that's where I'm going to go in here and say auth secret is a nice big long secret. Okay. I'm going to use the website I used yesterday. And that was down here. There it is, passwordgenerator.net. And I'll link that in, I'll share that link in Discord. So I'm going to generate myself a nice long 256 character password. Generate password, copy, paste that all in here. So I have a nice long password in there now.
Can you show what again what you
I just left all the defaults. I just said 256 and said go. Nothing fancy. So I'm going to toss that in as auth secret. So if you try to restart the server, it shouldn't crash it. So the problem is not going to be fixed. Go ahead and close that. The problem is going to be simply false. So that's just okay. So here it says token expires in, right? There's no token expires in. And so if you look at your so you have it. Using that. So if you got this, your server should restart. Why don't we go ahead and take a quick 10-minute break, sorry, let's call it 15-minute break. We'll take a 15-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll kind of test this, look at the logging route. So come back at 2:35.
So I have a question about the .env file.
Yep.
I was going to upload mine in Google Drive so I can have the same thing when I get home.
Yeah.
Get it out.
Yeah.
Is .env the extension, or is it just an extension of this file?
It's an extension, it's a nameless file.
A nameless file, something, right? So when I put something in parentheses, I put it before the extension. Typically, I would like to put parentheses after the file.
Oh.
This is the extension, right?
That is the extension. You just have your name.
Yeah, I made a really early in class. I made an env file and not a .env file, and I couldn't tell that it's wrong because they both just show a white. They just show that a white piece of paper in visual code.
Yeah, it's like I don't recognize that file.
Yeah,
It's just an unrecognized extension.
I'm still correct.
Yeah. So let's do this. So just Control S. And if you look at the error says auth sequence is not defined. So that's what we just had to do. We had to set the auth sequence here. And my guess is you don't have anything that's breaking into it. Environment file. So run start that. So you're doing this. So that should bring in. Yeah, it doesn't look like it's bringing in. Yeah, right. Vaguely remember that. It seems to be ignoring all of these things. Now, it's interesting that it shows here is that it's interesting that it shows here. I'm wondering if it's permissions from the root. should be reading, but it does not. Well, then do that. That's your, I'm not sure. You know what the little game is. I can go by features. So, properties. Full control. It's going to change the whole ACL. Access to what's going on. That may require an investigation from my company. What I will do for the moment, grab the password, exclude the special characters, and we'll put that in here first. If you have time to kind of stick around after class, let's try to debug that, because that's gonna be weird, and I don't know what's going on there. No problem. That's gonna take a little bit of time to unravel. Cody, are you all caught up? No. Okay, so what are you missing? Okay. Let's do the quick fix. But I need you to really do your best to try and keep up to date. I know. But if you follow behind, just try to keep doing what you're doing, especially if I'm dealing with another file. Right? So like we were jumping over to another file, you should have somebody right. check Discord. That's what's currently in there, in the user module. It's a bit more than I can fit all on screen. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Zoom back in. Okay, so one thing we didn't do when we left off, we didn't kind of give a last test with this to see if it worked. So Paul Smith 5, there we go. So now we finally, this is where we go. When I try to register an account, it goes through successfully, and here's a token. And so that's the token we can use to log in. Make sense? So we haven't talked about necessarily, when we talked about how to verify and use that token, we haven't kind of built that code in yet that's going to use this token. Okay. So but we've got a working registration. Is everybody good with that? Got a working registration route. One of the things I also want to mention is typically anytime we're issuing a token like this, we usually want to put it into a cookie as well, right? So far I've issued the token, but I haven't actually set a cookie to store that token. I'm passing it back here, but I really also like to pass it back in a cookie so that the client kind of preserves that. So back in here, I might say, let's create a cookie. So I'm going to say request.cookie, right? And I need to name the cookie, okay? So maybe we name this cookie something like Auth token. Auth token. The value of that cookie will be our actual token, so Auth token. I want to add some options. So for instance, to that cookie, I might want to add that is HTTP only, so my front-end code can't get to it. My front-end JavaScript can't get to that cookie. And I also may want to add in a max age, which is set from our configuration. So our max age is going to be, actually maybe I want to pull this off. So const cookie options, this is getting kind of big. I might want to pull that down here and just pass it like so. So the max age is going to come from config.get, and here I'm going to say cookie max age. Now in this case, I know that the max age, actually this is auth.cookie max age. In this case, I know that the max age has to be a number and not a string. So kind of like I did before, in fact, it has to be an integer. I'm going to say parse int because it has to be a whole number of milliseconds. So just to make sure we're actually getting an integer, I want to do that. So that right there will ensure that a cookie gets issued. Okay. So those two lines are just the ones we just added. How do we create? So if you try to do this in Postman, try to register an account. See if you can see the cookie that came back.
You're supposed to be responsive to me.
Okay. Yes. Oh, it should be response button. Yes, it should be response. I did that again. It should be response.cookie, not request. So this should be RES, not REQ. Okay. So just to kind of quickly jump over to Postman, and I'll come back to this here in a second. To jump over to, in case you don't have the code yet, I'm going to jump over to Postman and take a look at this. So if you can kind of watch my screen, I'm going to hit send. Okay. So I just created another account. If you look down here, you should see that there's a tab labeled cookies, and you see how it says more. So that means there's one cookie that was set with this request. And so I can actually go in there and look, and we can see that the cookie came back, right? So the cookie's name is Auth. The value is only shown in the first part. It's actually longer than that. Domain is localhost because we're running it on localhost. The path is /, which means it's available for the entire website. And it expires on Tuesday, 19th of October. Let me expand this a little bit because the expires in is interesting. So the expires on 2002 GMT. Okay, that's interesting. So what does that mean? So 2002 GMT. Well, right now, right, it's 2:41. We generally represent your time. You're kind of thinking AM PM. This is a military time. So we're looking at military time. 20 would be 12 plus 8, so it would be 8 p.m. Right? This came back and said, oh, it expires at 8 p.m. But we said it expires in 20 minutes, right? Is that right? Because we expect the expiry to come back at 3 o'clock, right? It's 3 o'clock. So notice that it says it's in GMT, the way it's showing this. So GMT is actually 5 hours ahead of Central Time. So we're at Central Time, we're 5 hours minus GMT. So if I were to subtract 5 from here, then I get 15, which pushes it at 3 o'clock. So there's a few things to have to kind of pay attention to there, is that it's in military time and it's representing it in GMT when you're trying to confirm if that's right. But this is something you absolutely want to check to make sure that the expiration date is what you expect, because that's very easy to get wrong. Very, very easy to get wrong in that process. So I always double check that those things are correct. You'll notice that there's our HTTP only flag is set to true, our secure flag is set to false. So those are the kind of things that we kind of had expected. Okay, so we can see that set up. It's also worth noting there's a little cookies button up here in the top right. That will actually show you all the cookies that that NodeMon is tracking. In fact, it just saved that cookie that came back. So Postman's actually saving that cookie kind of like a browser would send it. Everybody see that? You can manually add cookies in here and kind of play around with them. But as you can see, Postman automatically saved that cookie for us, which is great. It means we can then use that for testing later requests. Got it? So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind, because you can have cookies there and you can mess around with them in Postman. So you're going to either see cookies that were set or cookies just in general that you have sitting around. Questions around that? Okay. Is anybody still typing along with that? Are we good? Are we ready to move on to the next thing? So what are the things that we added to the register route that weren't there in your previous code, right? What are the things that are in here that you previously did not have in your issue tracker, in your register route? What are the new things? You said what? Okay. So for register, okay, things we've changed. We've hashed the password. What else? It's important we hash that password before we saved it to the database. What else? What else did we change? What else is new from what we've done before? So we issued a token. What else? Josh? Cookies. So we created a cookie too. So those are things we've changed. Okay. It's worth keeping track of what we're changing, because these are things you're going to need to remember to go do on your issue tracker project, right? So it's worth keeping track of what those things are. It's definitely worth making notes of those. Okay. What are other things that we've done in the application as a whole? What are other things we had to do to get this set up? You said what? Okay. So npm install, we needed some new packages over there. What else? What else have we done? What are the other changes?
Good
JavaScript file for hashing passwords? Yeah, I mean, I made a tool. That's one thing I did. Hash password tool. I mean, that's kind of a one-time thing.
Modify the config file.
Okay, so we modified the config files. So anything else we had to do in regards to that? Or were we kind of done with the config files? Aaron? Anything else we had to do after messing with the config files?
We increased
Right, so we modified the default as well as what other file? Yeah. So default and the END. We had to change both of those. So config files, what else? Danny? What are other things we had to change in the project? Remember, we made some changes to config and then things stopped working. You had a specific issue.
Yeah, we had to set up our environment variables.
Right. So remember we had to do something with the .env, right? Namely that we added like the secret, the auth secret to that, right? And we could have said all the other things there too, but that's the kind of minimum we had to do, is set that there. Okay. What else? What other files did we change? Don? Any other files we had to change? Server.js file. And we had to change the server.js file to do what? What did we change in server.js? Okay. What two things?
Well, one of them was, I guess actually one of the things we already done.
Okay.
Yeah, I was talking about the app that you added this.
Okay. What did I have to do?
Some errors.
Huh?
Through errors.
Yeah. So we had to, check the config and throw some errors. So we check the config. And threw errors if there was any problem with that. If there was anything missing, we went ahead and threw there. That way you have to go through and set it back. Okay? No, we don't keep going. So those are things that we've done already. Okay, so you want to keep track of those things again, because they're things that you're going to have to go do in your application. Cool? Okay. So the next set of changes we're going to make is we want to implement a login route. So we've got a way to make users. I want a way to log in users that are already created. Okay. And keep track of the things that we changed. Right? Keep track of what's different. I'm going to ask the same question. Okay. Starting with the login route, I'm going to go up top and I'm going to find another schema. So when we want to log in, you just need to provide the email and the password. You just don't need the full name, right? So schema created, right? Schema is almost identical to the registration schema. Very, very little that's different there. Okay. So we've got a login schema, which is just email and password. I'm going to go make a login route. So underneath the register route, router.post, we're going to say, what do we want to do when the user wants to log in? So when the user wants to log in, again, I want to validate the body. It needs to pass the login schema, async, request, response, next, arrow. Okay. So at this point, I can say I need a try catch. All right, so const login is equal to request.body. So I'm going to pull in the information that the user provided. call it login because it's not exactly a user. It's just parts of the user information. Okay. So from there, I should be able to say, let's go find that user. So const user is equal to await find user. Did I call it something else? Oh, I called it get user. Okay, I call it get user by email. That's why. Get user by email, login.email. Okay. So that should get a user from the database. And notice I'm only getting the user based on their email address because I don't know what I can't check their password. Right. My password that I have is in plain text. The password that's in the plain text in the database is hashed. So I have to do it this way. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to say, hey, if there's a user, right, well, then we know at least there's a user that came back. Okay. I know the email matches at that point. Otherwise, I've got immediately an error. So in this case, if it's an error, I can say res.status 400.error, and I can say something like, oh, not error, .json error, JSON error, and say like invalid credentials. Okay. So I either have a user or I don't have a user. Okay. Now typically, there's two different ways you can do this at this point. I could then also nest a check inside of here and say also then check for the password. I usually find it more readable to just kind of put that together. So I can say there's a user and the password is correct, which is usually what I do. So I go up here, I say, hey, there's a user and the password is correct. If I remember right, the library, the API for bcrypt is asynchronous, and I do think I have to await it. So I'm going to await bcrypt. So remember we used a hash to hash the password. I need to use, where is the method on here? I need to use compare to compare the passwords. So the order of parameters, remember, is important. If I remember right, the first thing I need to pass is the plain text password. So login.password. And the second parameter is user.password. Right? So this will be the plain text password that the user's typed in, and this right here would be that hashed password. Okay, so one of these is hashed and one of these is. If that's successful, then the user's provided valid credentials, and we can say res.json and send them back a nice message like welcome back. Okay. Now it's not going to stop here. We have to do a little bit more in this case. But that's kind of our starting point. Okay. So if I test this, I'm going to go over to Postman, and if you want to take a look at the screen. Just a thing to remember, typically you want to save some of these requests so you can repeat them. So I want to go ahead and save this request to my folder. So I'm going to go ahead and save. And I'm going to save this to pets. I'm actually going to make a new folder under pet adoption called user. And so this is going to be my register user request. because I may at some point want to come back and repeat this request and try it again. Okay. So let's make a new request once we save that one. And so here I want to go HTTP localhost 5000 /API /user /login. Okay. I can test it. I need to make sure I'm on a post request and hit send. Okay. And so far so good, right? I haven't provided any data, so it should give me an error. I need to just go over to body, switch it to that, and provide an email and password. So email would be like paul.smith@example.com. I think that's one of the users I created previously. And my password was password. And if I hit send, cool, welcome back. So it's able to go take this and check it against that hash password and come out successful. But if I change any part of that, so like leave off a letter, I can see that it fails. Oh, well, it fails for a different reason because it's saying the password length must be 8. So passwords. There we go. So it says invalid credentials if I pass along the password. Or otherwise not the same. Okay. That all makes sense?
Yeah.
Cool. So what have we changed so far? What's one of the things we've already introduced?
The route.
Huh?
The route.
So we introduced the login route, which remember you already have the login route in your tracker project. Okay. So what's different about this from the code you already have?
Comparing the password with the password.
Okay. Password to hash password using bcrypt, right? So the part that's new in there is you're using bcrypt .compare. Okay. Versus over here, we're using bcrypt .hash for the password. Okay. So we've got that in play, and that can test the password. Okay. Now, does that answer your previous question, Evan, about how does it check it? You're asking previously, well, it's different, right? All these users that I created have different passwords or different hashes, even though they have the same password. This is where it comes back. Right? This is where it comes back. Yeah, using that salt. Because the salt is different, they have different hashes. The salts are all the same. They all have the same password. Okay. So that's a start. Now, we need to do some of the same logic that we just did with the registration route. So just like with the registration route, we want to issue a token and then put that in a cookie. Okay. Which the good news is, we've already written all that code. There is no difference. We can take this code, issue token, create a cookie. I'm going to just borrow it. Issue token and create a cookie. This is the same story. So once we've compared the passwords and once we've determined that they're the same, it's the same thing when we need to issue a cookie. Sorry, issue a token, create a cookie.
So when you send the cookie after you send the response in JSON?
No, you can't. You can't. Because cookies are sent back as a header. Cookies are sent back in a header. And so I can't write headers after I've called JSON. After I started writing the body, I can no longer write headers. So this does have to happen before the response is ready. Huh? Yeah, same story, or write, or end, etc., etc. Anything that's going to modify the body, you can't. Once you've written any part of the body, you can't go back to headers because headers always come first in the response. So I've got that. I also want to add in the user ID. And so the user ID, kind of like we did before, would be user underscore ID. I also want the token to come back. And so that would be auth token. So if our front end needs to play around with those variables, the user ID, or the token, it can get access to those at least temporarily. Oftentimes I may want the code, I've kind of done, these are conflicting. Here I said, hey, I don't want the JavaScript to have access to the cookie, which means it can't write it or modify it. But I've kind of also said, well, maybe the code might want to have access to the token here, because depending on how you set things up. Oftentimes, if we're doing stuff with local storage, which I think is what going to be our plan for working with React, I'm actually going to be using this from the token that comes back over this cookie. But a lot of times you may want to use the cookie there as well. Okay. The other side of things is because this cookie is issued for the domain of the API, our front end will actually be running on a different domain. So we may or may not have that cookie to work with. Does that make sense? We may have to set up another cookie. So that's why I'm sending it back 2 ways. Okay. So testing that with Postman, you should have this. Welcome back. Here's your user ID. Here's a token. And in fact, every time you hit send, actually it looks like it's generating the same. Oh, no, it is different. It is different because the last part, the signature changes because the expiration date is changing. Because the expiration date for the cookie is changing, that last signature will change. Yep. So it's a modular panel. Can't find module big there. So backwards, but you want to run it. Not that. You'll say, right here on the line. Well, that's not going to work because it's not. It's not going to be made. It's like it constantly. Plain text passwords and that don't work. We've actually, because of how we do it here, it's worth noting any users in there that still have a plain text password. Which is part of where we had to convert those over. Okay. Last thing for the user module is I've created a registration route. I've created a login route. I also need to create a route to update users. Okay. So in terms of updating users, again, we need a schema of some sort. So if I'm talking about the schema for users, okay, what things are your users allowed to change? Okay, they're definitely allowed to change the password. Are they allowed to change the email address? I'd say large in part no, because it's your main username. Okay.
So how does that process work? Because I know like you can like usually get a hold of them, but it's just like they have to like.
Yeah, like they could go in and have, oftentimes you might make that like an admin sort of sign off thing, or you usually add some more restrictions around it, where maybe there's a special process to change your email address. Usually requires a lot more authentication, a lot more security, you know, in terms of sending emails and doing things. And some of this has to do with JWT and a lot of different things, or sending emails. So you usually say, hey, send an email to the new email address. That person has to click on the link to actually be able to change the email address. If you don't click on that link, then the email address doesn't change. Because otherwise you could end up with an account that has an email that doesn't go with any user. If they fat finger the email address, now their account's just floating out there. That'd be a problem, right? So usually email is a special process. Password sometimes is a special process. But the main two things here, we're just changing password info, basically. Password info. And I might say, like I've done before, that they don't have to change them, right? They don't have to change their password. They don't have to change their full name, so neither of those are required. Okay, both of those are optional. So let's add another route to update the user. Router dot put, and my route here, put user ID and this would be the update schema. Now, one thing at this point, we usually have more than one update route, okay? We usually have more than one update. Part of the reason for that is if I think about this route will actually let me modify any user in the system. Does that make sense? This route will let me modify any user in the system. So typically this route is only accessible to administrators. Only available to administrators. They should be the only one that has any access to this route. Does that make sense? But I also, at some point, want my users to be able to update their own information. Is everybody with that? So this is the administrator route, but I usually have like a self-service route as well. Okay? So what I actually do is I make a very similar route. I would say put/me. So me is only to update myself versus user ID would be updated user. Now, it's worth noting that these need to be in the correct order, right? If I do them in this order, where the me is second, the me will actually never get called, okay? Because if I type in me, it will go to this first route here. We'll go to this first route with user ID. So I need to put that route before. So I kind of started putting it here just to show that I need to make sure that it's in that order. Me, user ID, me, user ID. Anytime you have something with a variable, that should be next after something that is fixed. Cool. That's important here because these are both put. These are fine. These login and register can be in any router, in any route, in any order because they are register and login. They're both fixed. There's no variables in them. And it doesn't matter between these two because this is good post and post. Okay, cool. Everybody good with that? So that's the order we're going to put those routes in. Okay. So if I want to put a comment on this one, this is self-service update, and this would be the admin update. So they'll use different routes. And that means that I can allow anybody to use this route. Anybody that's logged in can use this route, but only administrators can use this route. That makes the security a lot easier to enforce. Cool. Questions? Does that make sense? So we don't have all the stuff in place to set up the self-service route, but we can start setting up the admin route. So I'm going to have to come back to the self-service route. All right, so in the admin route, just like before, try catch. Next, error. Okay. I want to say, what is the user allowed to update? What is the user ID? So const user ID is equal to request.userid const update is equal to request.body. Okay. Now it looks like I did forget to add the valid ID middleware. So I need to add that in here with the key being user ID. Checking up at the top of the file. That also means I need to bring it in up here. So I'm going to add valid ID up top. Valid ID up top, and then we're going to come back and add it down below. So back down here. Okay. So I got valid ID, user ID, valid body, update schema, and then I'm bringing in the user ID and the update. Okay. So now I can try to go to the database, const db result, and look at what happens. So db result is equal to await and go to the update user, pass in the user ID and the update. So it knows which user to update and how to update it. I'm going to do a debug so I can see what came back from there. So let's say update result db result, and I'm going to send back res.json with the message user updated and the user ID. So this should allow me to pick a user and try to update their password as well as their full. Okay. So if you want to watch my screen, I'll kind of show you what happens right now. There's one or two issues with what's already there. Okay. So let's look at how this works right now. Again, I want to kind of save this route. So this is going to be my login user. Save. I kind of saw the user ID is here, so I'm going to use that in my other route. HTTP : API user. Oh, I'm missing localhost. Localhost 5000. API user. And I'm going to say let's update that. I need to make that put request. Put send. Okay. So if I don't pass anything, it's happy because I said I didn't want to change anything. If I want to go here, just checking the logs. When I told it not to update anything, let's look at what the result is briefly. We haven't really talked about this yet, but this is the thing I'm returning from the database. Okay. So the database, when you do an update, gives you back an interesting document. You can see it says acknowledged, true. Just ignore that acknowledged flag just so we're clear. It doesn't mean what you think it means. So acknowledged, true, modified count 0. Modified count 0 says it didn't modify any data because there wasn't anything to change. Okay, so there was nothing to change, it didn't modify anything. Upserted count, upserted ID, matched count. So the two numbers of interest to us are matched count and a modified count. So it found the user, but it didn't modify them because there was nothing to modify. Is everybody good with that? So I might change my code a little bit using that to give the user a different message if the user doesn't exist. So I might say, hey, after we've got that, well, if the DB result, if that result dot matched count, so I'm using matched count and not modified, if it's greater than 0, we know we found the user and the user has been updated. Otherwise, we might send back for error, res JSON, or res status, for JSON, error, user not found. So that's one way I can do this. I can do this differently a little bit with the update. We haven't really talked about that because I wanted to give people some kind of practice with just making queries and get requests with the database. So I haven't really talked about that that's even an option, but that is one that's available there. It does give you some more results. And the benefit of doing it this way is it does actually reduce the number of trips to the database here. So now I only have to make one trip to the database to just try to do the update. And if it fails, well then, I immediately, if there's no user match, then I immediately know that it's done. Right? That can speed things up a little bit because I don't have to get the user and then update them. Cool? Questions? Kind of cool? Adds a little bit to what we have. And we can play around with that. So I'm going to go back to Postman, hit send, still says user updated. But if I change one of these numbers to something that's invalid, it's going to say user not found with a 4 signs. Cool so far? Cody, you're still coding along, or you caught up? Okay. So that's kind of our start, right? Let me try to set the password and the full name, or maybe just set one. So I'm going to set the full name, test user, hit send. If I try to look at the users now, I should have one with the name of test user, which he's there, right? So this guy's name has been changed to test user. Okay. Now notice right now I haven't set the password. Password's still good, right? Password's still good. Still looks like hash. If I try to change the password, okay. As far as it's concerned, it went through successfully, right? It's fine. You gave it a good password. The password was valid. It saved it to the database. But if I look at what's in the database, user's password just got saved in plain text. You see that? That's a problem, right? So when we're updating users, specifically the user is changing their password, we need to make sure that that password gets hashed. Is everybody good with that? If they're changing their password, we need to make sure that it gets hashed. Okay? So I need to add that logic anytime I update the user. We say if the user wants to change their password, we need to hash it and save the hashed password. Okay? Which you kind of remember what we did with the other side of that, right? It would look like something going here, kind of in the middle. I would say, hey, let's take update.password and replace it with await bcrypt.hash. So we want to hash their password. So take the password that they're trying to set it to, update.password, run it through the requisite number of salt rounds, and save it back. Okay, so const salt rounds is equal to parse int, and pull that from the config. Config.get auth on salt rounds. Okay. So I'm going to add those two lines of code together. Get the salt rounds, hash the password. Yes.
That assumes that there's a password here.
It does. It does. You're right. So let's test this, and yeah, you're going to see that that is wrong, that has an issue. So I'm going to go back to here, just send the password. Okay. So if I do send the password, then in the database it does work, right? So if I do pass a password, it does come through and sets it. If I don't send, data and salt arguments are required, right? So it actually gets to here, it gets to this line of code. You try to tell it to do the hash. It says, well, I can't hash undefined because the password's not there, right? So how do I fix it? Okay.
I would just say, like, if update got password, like if it's there,
right,
do it, else do it.
Exactly. So if the user gave us a password that they want to change it to, then we'll hash it. Otherwise, we're just going to leave it alone. So if there is a password there, we'll hash that password. Otherwise, we just send out our business. Problem solved. right? So you see we have two places that we need hash to. We need hash password in the register account, or anytime they change their password. We have to do that as well. Good. Right? So the main thing that we're seeing here is the only thing you really have to change to the update route is that little block of code. In the update route, everything else you already have. Everything else that's in here, you already have. You've done the previous steps. This is the only part that's new. You just say, if there's a password, hash the password, and use that to update it. So most of these changes, as you'll see, it should be relatively small changes to the code you already have, the project you're already working on. We're just adding more layers of security. Okay, we're just adding more security features as we kind of go along with this. Okay, that's the three pieces for that module. Okay. I still need to look at the self-service route. The self-service route is going to have a lot in common with this. The problem is I need to figure out how do I get the user ID. And so what I need to do in order to get the user ID, I'm probably going to want to pull it out of that token, right? Out of the cookie that we issued. Does that make sense? I'm going to say take that cookie that the user gave us and pull out the data that's there. Does that make sense? Now, one of the things that happens there, in order to kind of deal with that, we have that route plus a bunch of other routes that we'll want to update to where they can use that token to authenticate the user, right? We have a bunch of code that we'll actually want to hook up sort of application-wide in a bunch of different places. And what was one of those tricks that we used to be able to hook up code to a bunch of different routes last week? We created a middleware, right? Remember we created that valid ID middleware, that valid body middleware, so that we could take a lot of code out of the route. Okay. Authentication there's enough code required there. You really don't want to duplicate it. You really, really do not want to do this without a middleware, just so we're clear. When we're dealing with authentication and checking the token, there's going to be enough there that you really do not want to reproduce because it's going to affect virtually every route in your application. Okay. This is the part where we get to, we're going to change the whole program from here on. We kind of changed just the user module so far, but I really need to change a lot more than that now. Okay. So things to think about. There's a few different ways that the data can be sent. I might start by let's come back to that. Let's talk about how we built that middleware. So I'm going to go make a new file under middleware. I'm going to call that auth. auth.js. Okay. So remember, part of the structure of creating that, when we created the valid body middleware, we had this kind of outer function, we call the factory function, produces the middleware function inside, we then return that, that's what we're exporting. Okay. So we're exporting like the factory function. Okay. I'm going to take the same path here just in case I decide later I want this to be configurable. So I'm going to say let's define a function. So const auth is equal to just no parameters at the moment. Did I do that for both of those? Yes, I did. Okay. So no parameters right now. And I want to export that. Module.exports equals auth. Okay. Inside here is where I'm going to actually write that middleware. So return request response next. Okay. So now we need to talk about how do I kind of work with the tokens that the user is giving me, and how do I use that for authentication purposes, right? So, for instance, if we were to look at the update route that we just built, anybody on the internet can go update users right. Anybody can change anybody's password. We haven't blocked that at all, right? So one of the stipulations I want to add is I want to say, well, let's only let people that are logged in, or maybe let's only let people that are logged in update other users, okay? Maybe you have to be logged in to update another user's data. So I need to check your authentication. I need to check that token and see if it's valid and not expired, okay? So in here, I'm going to need to read that. Now, you'll remember that we stored it in a cookie, so I might say auth cookie is equal to request.cookies.auth token. We stored it in a cookie named auth token. And then I want to validate that token. So I might say, let's bring in JWT, const JWT equals require JSON web token. Okay. Here I will then say jwt.verify. So we're going to verify the auth cookie. In order to verify the cookie, I need the secret. So const auth secret. Do you remember where we pulled the secret from? But is config, right? It is from the config, indirectly from the environment variable. What config option was that? So it was auth.secret. And so I'm going to pass that as the second argument. That does mean I need to require config up here in order for this to work, because I didn't actually require config. Const config equals require. Okay. And what I might want to then do is I might want to say that returns the payload. Const auth payload comes back from JWT verify. I want to add that to the request. So request.auth is equal to auth payload. So I'm adding a property again, kind of like we did with some of the other ones, like I've modified the body, I added an ID back to the request object. I'm going to add an auth property to the request object. So for now, I can just refer to request.auth in my other files. That's basically what this is going to enable me to do. And then let's call next at the end of this. Fair forewarning, this is not complete yet. Okay, there is more code that will need to go in here. Why is auth cookie? Oh, that's why. Yep, that's why. So that's kind of how I'm going to start setting this up. Okay, I need to add a little bit more to it because there's not enough here yet. So what I want to do, my goal actually is I want to add this everywhere. So we've kind of looked already, you know, if you have a middleware that you want to just add to a single module, single route, I can bring it in like this and then add it to that route itself, right? I can add a route. I could say in here, well, let's add this auth middleware, right? Add that in one of those places. But I really don't want to do that because I actually want to add auth to every route in my entire application. Does that make sense? I actually want to have this middleware be run on every single route that is in the entire application. And so if I define it route by route by route, that's going to be a lot of code. I'm going to do it in server. So back in server, if we look at some of the stuff we've done previously, I'm down here on line 48-ish. You'll see that I've actually already installed some middlewares globally. Okay, this express URL encoded is already running on every route. Same with express JSON. These pre-built middlewares I've installed into the entire application, and so I can do the same thing with my own middleware. Right? You can either install middleware at the application level, or you can install it at the route level. It's also possible to just install it for a whole router, which is kind of the end in between. But that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to say app.use. Now I'm going to go ahead and just require it here directly dot middleware /auth. I do need a pair of parentheses at the end here, because remember I need to call that factory function. And so by adding this one line, line 49, that auth middleware is running for literally every request the user makes. Literally every request the user makes. We'll check that off cookie code. Everybody good with that? Okay. That's what we want to do. Okay. There's going to be some issues. Okay. There's going to be some issues. So let's test a few things out. So I'm going to go back to user. Okay. In this self-service route, which we haven't finished yet, I'm going to do a debug and debug request.auth because I want to see what's going on there. And res.json just send something back for testing purposes. So if I try in Postman to try to edit myself, okay, it's going to say cannot read properties of undefined. It cannot read properties of undefined. Okay, so there's a few issues going on. So let's look at the stack trace and see if we can diagnose the problem. So diagnosing the problem here, it says cannot read properties of undefined. Okay. And we can look at that, and that points us to our auth.js file. So they see that auth.js should be pointing to auth.js line 6. Okay. If I look at my line 6 and kind of compare that with the token, with the thing, it says cannot read property of auth token. That's here. There's a problem reading the cookie. I didn't get past the first line. Gee, okay. Yes. That's a good question. Uh-huh. I think it's different. I think it's different. So, yes, I think when you set a cookie, you call the cookie function, but when you read a cookie, I believe it's the cookie's property. So it's also, this is on the request, and the other one was on the response. What's actually happening here is the same thing that happened with request.body initially, is that we didn't have a middleware to parse the body. We need a middleware to parse the cookies. So we never actually installed the middleware to parse the cookies. So we can't actually read any of the cookies. So request.cookies right now is undefined itself. It's not the auth token that's missing, it's the entire cookies that are missing. Okay, that's what's going on. So I need to install a middleware to do that. And notice that I've got a middleware here that depends on the cookies being there, right? My auth middleware depends on the cookies being there. So wherever I install that cookies middleware has to be before the auth middleware. So everybody follow with that? Because otherwise request cookies won't be there. So before that, I need to go in here, app.use, and require the cookie parser. We installed it previously, we didn't actually use it. So I'm going to require the cookie parser. I think I still missed something. I think maybe, let me just check, I might need a pair of parentheses. npm cookie parser. Let's check. So when I install the cookie parser, yes, it does have parentheses because it's a factory just like ours is a factory. So I do need to have parentheses there. There we go. JWT must be provided. Okay, so it's a different error, right? So that's what there's my cookie parser. Everybody got that? Cookie parser before our authentication middleware. So put that right in there. Okay, back to what is this error now? So JWT must be provided, module.exports, looks like it's auth.js line 8. So on line 8, verify secret JWT must be provided. Well, let's do some debugging. So I'm going to go up here, const debug require, and I want to require the debug module, specify this as app colon middleware colon auth. And so I want to debug and see what some of these things are. So let's debug, and I'll do it the line after. So debug auth cookie and auth secret. Okay. Let's see if what that comes back as. So I should see something in the log. Okay. Oh, one of these is still coming up as undefined. Okay. So the auth cookie variable is still coming up defined. I think you might be right. You might be right that it's actually cookie at this point. Nope, that's a different error. Cannot read properties of undefined. So, cookies it is. Okay. I wonder, ooh, okay. So there's actually no cookie that I'm sending them, right? if I look at what's right now in Postman, there's actually no auth cookie that I'm sending. Might have been that it expired. It may be that just we never had one. Okay. So I don't have one that I'm sending there. Okay. And so one of the things I need to do is I do need to check if there even is a cookie there to begin with, right? Because there may or may not be a cookie that the user is sending me, right? So I might say if there is an auth cookie, then we can try to check it, right? There's no point in checking a cookie that isn't there. That just leads to errors. Okay. All right. So if there's no cookie there, then I just proceed. Otherwise, we're going to check the cookie. So let's try send again. Okay. So this time it does log as me. If I look at the console, though, remember I wanted to log the request auth. Maybe I go in here and just put a label on that. So that's easier to see. So in there, oh, did it not save? There it is. So auth is undefined, right? So when I come in here to request auth, it's not there because I didn't provide a cookie. Okay, all good so far. So right now we fixed at least one of the things, right? We fixed two of the things. We fixed two things. We fixed so it doesn't break. We installed the cookie parser, so the cookies are parsed, and we also checked if there even is a cookie there at all. So let's say I want to add a cookie. I'm going to go to Postman and we're going to add a cookie. Okay. So follow along with me. We're going to go into the cookies button here in this request. I'm going to pop this up, add a cookie. Okay. The cookie here gives you a bunch of different options about what to put for it. I want to, at the beginning, you see it says cookie 1 equals value. That's the name of the cookie. So there I want to put auth token. That's what's in our code. Auth token, camel case. And maybe I just try as a 1, 2, 3, 4. Obviously, that's not a valid token. Obviously, this is not going to be a valid token. But I want to add that cookie. What are you seeing over there? Okay. You may need to do that. So okay. Yeah. Get out of there. You need to add a domain name. On the right, you need to add a local host. So it's just local host. Just local host. Just local host. Yep. Local host is good. Now you know that. Okay. So the important part there is you're going to say auth token is 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see it's expiring to 2052. So it's kind of set the expiration day out a little bit, although I think that's in the past at this point. So I might want to move this all the way up to tomorrow. So the 20th of October. So I'm going to give my cookie a good lifetime. Set it up tomorrow.
Mine says it expired Wednesday, October 19th, but today is Tuesday, October 19th.
Oh.
Oh, 2022, that's why. It's a year.
Oh, it's a year later.
So it's already
It's
done.
a year later. Okay. Well, then I don't need to set it up to the 20th. I missed the year. I just need to set it up to 19th. I thought it already pushed it out when I tested it. So the important part is just the front part. So once you get that put in, go ahead and hit save.
Once you do this, okay, let's go to calendar. Go to default result. And type that's it. That way it's people can touch. You have the external, you have the stuff. So go ahead and see. Yeah. So go ahead and see that. So we made this cookie, right? We put it out here, we put it in there. Obviously, this token is not valid. Okay, that's fine. That happens, right? You're going to have a lot of cases where the user might be, this token is invalid is not an unusual thing because the user might have manually changed their cookie because they're trying to get access that they shouldn't have. So this is not unusual. Okay, that's an error we do need to deal with. And it also might be that their cookies has expired. Both of those can kind of give errors like this, right? So what that means, right, what we have to recognize is cases like this will cause your verify method to throw an exception, okay? So it's not unusual for you to get exceptions in this code, okay? We need to catch those exceptions. So what I do is I'm going to take the top part of this function, try. Notice I'm not wrapping next in this loop in there, because regardless of what happens, I always want to go to the next middleware for this one. So if anything goes wrong with checking the token, then I'm going to go ahead and proceed to debug, log that error. But I'm going to let the user keep going. Okay. It just means that at that point, they have a cookie, but it's not valid, so we're not going to use it for authentication. So request.auth from here is going to be undefined, versus if it was a valid cookie, it would be defined. Does that make sense? So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say, if it's invalid, just keep going. So I'm going to hit save, hit send, okay? That's all fine and good. So, but auth is still undefined, okay? So what I want to do is I want to kind of borrow from my login route. Oh, did I? What happened to my, oh, because I changed my password. So my new password was test user. So I'm going to borrow this token. Everybody see that token? And I'm going to put that into my cookies. So previously we kind of created our own.
Yeah, let's actually put it out there. Okay. Actually, so when I did the login route, you'll notice it automatically replaced the cookie that I saw. Okay, fine. I probably want to push this out. So I'm going to kind of cheat on that. And I'm going to push it out to tomorrow, the 20th, Wednesday. I'm not editing the token, I'm editing the cookie. I can't edit the token, but I can edit the cookie. Right? So one thing is editable and the other thing is not, right? I can edit the cookie. There's no way to stop the user from editing the cookie. So I'm going to extend the lifetime of the cookie. Maybe, there we kind of see something. I want to kind of return the data here. I'm going to switch that real quick. So if I try to hit me now, see how it's sending back. This is the stuff that was inside the token. If I return request.auth. Everybody see that on my screen? So we're sending the data back. If we look at what's in there, we see things like, hey, here's the ID of the user, here's the email, here's the full name, here's the role. Those are all things we stuffed in when we created the token. Okay. You also see there's an IAT. IAT stands for issued at. EXP stands for expires. So that's actually telling you when it was issued and when the token expires. Both of those things are helpful. Okay. So now we've got that data, right? Now when we get in here, we can see, okay, if request.auth is there, the user's logged in, and we can use that data. So everybody see that? If the request.auth is sent, there's the user's information. And so I can use that to get things like their user ID, right? The user ID of who is logged in. Okay. So if I want to see what user we want to update, I'm going to put this in a try catch as before. Okay. If I want to see who we're updating, I might say, well, const user ID. That is from the auth. There. Now, I might want to guard this and make sure that, hey, the users can't do anything if they're not logged in. So I might say, for instance, if request.auth, if that's not there, then I want to go ahead and just get out of here. So maybe we return res.status. Let's just say this is a 400 request, 400 error, sorry, 400 number, and JSON error. You must be logged in. Okay, so I can throw an error if the user is not logged in. Otherwise, I can get their user ID and I can start to work through how to update. So I can say update is request.body. We want to do const db result is equal to await update user. So we'll take that user ID and the update, try to update the user, might want to log that, debug and request.json, send back a message, something like user updated. Okay. Well, let's give this a trial run. So I'm not setting anything right now. I'm going to go ahead and hit send. res.json. Okay. So it says user updated. It's happy right now, right? It's happy right now with the updating user because I'm logged in, right? So it's taking that user ID from the token and using that to determine which user to update. Now there is some issues. We need to debug a little bit. One thing I want to point out, watch what happens if I remove that cookie. No cookie, right? No cookie. User's not logged in anymore. This is part of what we're trying to get to. This is part of the whole authentication system. It's like saying, hey, user's not logged in, you can't do this, right? So that's part of that system, right? Having that auth middleware helps kind of take part of like the heavy lifting and move it out of the rest of the modules. So here we just have to say, hey, is the user logged in or not? If they're not logged in, we're done, right? Otherwise, we can proceed with this stuff. Questions? Does that much make sense, that first part, right? Just say, hey, it's not there because the previous code, the auth middleware, it either didn't find a cookie or the cookie was invalid or it was expired. Any of those kind of things happen, then we get down here and there's no request.auth. Okay, so we don't have to check for all of these bazillion different things that could have gone wrong, that could have meant that they didn't get authenticated. We just say yes or no. They're either authenticated or they're not authenticated. And we also know who they are. Okay, now let's take a look here. Let me get logged in again. So I'm going to log in again, get a new token, and I'm going to try to set this user's full name. Okay. Looks good, right? Looks good. So let's check the database. If I check the database, notice that my user's name didn't change. There's no test user, they're not my user. Okay? There's no test user, they're not my user. Something's not right. Everybody see that? Something's not right. The user didn't actually get updated. So if I look at here, let's look at what the update result came back as. Modified count is 0, match count is 0. It didn't find the user and then didn't modify it. Well, why didn't find our user? Yep, that's why. It's again the same thing. So our user ID that we're getting in is a string. So we need to convert it to an object ID. So take the ID here, new ID, try it again, send. This time, once I converted it to an object ID that did match a user and did update their file. That's a little gotcha, right? Again, we've kind of seen some of this stuff before, right? So I'm sure you've run into that a few times where you're using object a string instead of an object type. So that's not new. It's something we have to still remember to do. Cool. Okay. What about the password? So remember, this also allows me to update the password. And so same kind of thing. Send back to plain text password. Right? Remember what we had to do to block that? What was the thing we had to do to block it from being plain text? HTTPS.
We had to see if they gave us a password.
Right. Did they give us a new password that they had to change? And if they did, then hash it. Yes. Okay, so here we go. We need to do it kind of in between here. So we're going to say if update.password, then update. Actually, I'm going to borrow the code from over here so I don't have to rewrite it, because it's the same as our other update route. So that puts our whole code for our self-service relatively similar. The difference is we're using request.auth as a way of finding out who the user is that's logged in. Cool. So most of the new logic is kind of elsewhere in that middleware. Okay. Are there any questions? Kind of running low on time.
I got a small error in the server data. From the app.use require middleware Auth.
Yeah, and you're also doing the same thing with Parser.
I could have just imported them and called it by the name, right?
You could, yeah, you could do it that way too. You could do it that way too in 2 steps. I did that with trying. I'll get that to you very much. And you just come over here, download it for you. Okay. That's fine. That's fine. You have it. I don't have it. No. So what you want to do is you will log it. Log in with the you're missing some something wrong. Okay, so go back to the code. You never actually wrapped it in the try catch. If you did, but the try catch is in the wrong place. So you see wrap this whole function. So So take out the right catch. So within this is actually, so all of a sudden down like this, that's actually one side. So this is the main. So the map section is inside there. Outside of that. Yes. All right, so there is some more stuff that we kind of need to do. Some of it, obviously, we're going to have to do tomorrow. I'm just trying to see where everything's
I think that's something to work on. And if my comment is like, we have the same format we have to, if my comment is that, you know, works fine. Yeah,
so put it back in. And then we'll look at your yeah. The fire is on. That's fine. Yeah, it's easy to kind of make a small one-word mistake with this stuff. So, does that kind of give you an idea where these are starting to connect the dots? You know, so we've got, you know, we talked about how to do the login, how to do the register, how to do the update. We talked about how to update yourself as well as how to update another user. One of the big thing that I didn't get to talk about today is there is maybe a little bit more logic we might want to put in here. Okay. So tomorrow, that's one of the things we need to talk about, how to extend this. So we didn't talk about like the authorization header, which is kind of the next thing on my lecture notes from yesterday that I handed out. So we need to talk about the authorization header tomorrow. So there's a little bit of it in there. And the other part we want to do, anytime the user makes a change, we want to track who's doing that change. Does that make sense? And we can do that now because we know who's logged in, right? Because we know who's logged in now, we can track who made the change. Cool. We didn't have that option previously because we didn't have a way for you to log in and then prove that you were logged in, right? You would have had to provide your user and your password to every single route, and we don't really want to do that. We want to say, here's a cookie that proves I'm logged in. We provide some standardized functionality that the rest of the code doesn't have to do. Cool. So that's what we'll do tomorrow. That's what we'll do tomorrow. And that will get you where you need to be for the one. So things you want to make sure you're taking notes on. There's the change. We made 5 changes to the application as a whole. You'll notice that we've added some additional things now. So we added the cookie parser middleware in server.js. Server.js. We added cookie parser. And Auth. We added those there. In terms of login, you know, we had to do hash, issue token, create create cookie here, not create cookie, create cookie, and we had to kind of do the same thing over here. Issue token and create the cookie. Over when we did update, the big thing we had to remember to do when we update a user, we have to remember to hash their password. Right. So those are things we have to remember to update. Those are things you'll have to do with your bug tracker. So these are things you're going to have to. We did it once today. We have to do it again. Okay. With the bug tracker project. And hopefully things will settle more the second time you do it. Any questions for me? All right, so I'm going to check in again, everybody here, seeing if we're. Did you get all that? Was it all? Okay. Okay. Yeah, definitely do that. Yeah, most of those. Like, I don't want you to fall down. Yes, everything. You know what this means? Although you guys, yeah, like 34. I'm just looking at one or the card that doesn't have the free low emo, baby. That's why you're stuck. Silver and what, bro? You got first off, flat. Second off, I don't fit on it. You don't forget the Windows 11. Really? I mean, I don't upgrade to Windows 11 probably ever. So, like, how do you even upgrade the Windows 11? It's like, it's supposed to have this thing on your motherboard. Like, TPM or something. Because I have an old one. It is. Or actually, it's usually JS. 9135. Let's see. Okay, this won't work because the reason why this is wrong is because this is floating outside of it. Okay, now all of this code is not real. That's a major problem. That's a major problem because that code needs to be clean and
So you can go away. Or calm it down, whatever. And it can't be there. It's supposed to be somewhere else. So we have to be careful about where to put it. So that would be so the question is what that probably what would you say your biggest slowdown is? Like, I worked in 2008. That's what I played lower work. I'm just gone.